This webinar is part of our ongoing effort to engage researchers, designers, and collaborators in systems level approaches to ecological and cultural resilience. And today's focus, Colorado's San Luis Valley, is one of the most ecologically significant agricultural regions in the state, and also a region where questions of water and land come into sharp relief. I want to take a few minutes to share how we arrived at this moment and how the San Luis Valley became an important site for the Institute's work. In 2022, we led a field workshop in Colorado in partnership with the Mountain Studies Institute, where we worked closely with hydrologist Jake Kurzweil, who introduced us to the dust on snow phenomenon in the San Juan Mountains. That initial exposure sparked deeper questions that ultimately led us to launch a separate participatory design project focused specifically on dust on snow and its regional implications. So this new project brought together a core team of 6 local leaders and 15 interdisciplinary researchers from across the region and the country. And for 6 months, they worked collaboratively in 3 separate teams to explore the issue through multiple lenses. And together, they developed actionable proposals, which were presented in a public symposium we held last fall in Cortez. All the teams offered creative and thoughtful ideas, and I was especially drawn to the work of the San Luis Valley team, which was led by Patrick O'Neill, the group created a set of proposals that sat right at the intersection of soil conservation, water management, and regenerative agriculture. So after the event, I reached out to Patrick. I asked him what he thought a meaningful next step might look like in the Valley, and he said, talk to Angie Mestas. And Angie said, bring in Madeline Wilson. And Madeline said, talk to Jocelyn Catterson. And then on and on. Rebecca Lample, Heather Dutton, and so many other amazing people. And that's been the pattern. Each person has brought others in, and that kind of momentum really only happens in places where people are deeply invested and truly generous. And it's been an incredible community to be welcomed into. And I guess that's the point. That this kind of work, the kind of collaborative interdisciplinary research and education that the Wright-Ingraham Institute is known for, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It only works when it's grounded in a place and rooted in relationships. And that's what makes this work transformative. So our methods and research models, they're important and they're what makes us unique, but the real power, the real foundation for systems change happens through deep ties to landscapes and communities. So today we'll hear from 2 experts, Heather Dutton and Madeline Wilson, who will provide multiple perspectives at the nexus of land and water in the San Luis Valley. Dylan will introduce them in just a moment. This webinar sets the stage for our upcoming event, Working the Llanos Sin Agua, a regenerative agriculture summit and range school, which will take place next week, July 10th and 11th in Antonito, Colorado. The link for that is in the chat. And so if you plan to join us, we'd love to have you. We're also planning a 3-week advanced summer fellowship program in the San Luis Valley in 2026, which is designed for graduate students and early career professionals. It'll go much deeper into the themes we're discussing today and include the development of collaborative projects with partner organizations across the Valley. So we're building this with many local partners, some of whom are here today, and we'll be recruiting applications for that in September. I want to thank CSU Extension and the Center for Collaborative Conservation and the Soil and Water Conservation Society for their support for that event. And with that, thank you again. And Dylan, take it away.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tal. And hello, everyone. So I'm Dylan Gauthier. I am the Director of Research here at Wright-Ingraham Institute. And it's my pleasure to get to introduce today's 2 fabulous speakers. First off, I just wanted to thank, again, Madeline Wilson, Angie Mestas, Jocelyn Catterson, Heather Dutton, Bill Britton, everybody who has been supportive in helping us bring this event together. This was initially Madeline's idea to, Madeline had the idea to extend this kind offer of a teach-in for Wright-Ingraham staff, board, and direct collaborators. And I'm really grateful to Madeline for welcoming our suggestion to open this event up to our broader community. And also just thankful for you all for being with us here today. So we will have a Q&A at the end after we hear from Heather Dutton and then Madeline Wilson. So please hold your questions for the end. I think everyone is muted as they were coming in here, but just in case at the end we'll be able to unmute ourselves and ask questions. You can also queue up questions in the chat if you'd like to do that. So please do feel free to make use of the Zoom chat there. So without further ado, our first speaker today is Heather Dutton, who is the manager of the San Luis Valley Water Conservancy District. Her work focuses on water management and conservation in the Upper Rio Grande Basin. Prior to her work for the district, Heather was the executive director of the Rio Grande Headwaters Restoration Project. She currently serves on the Interbasin Compact Committee, IBCC, Colorado State University Water Center Advisory Board, and Colorado Rio Grande Restoration Foundation Board. After Heather's introduction and presentation, we will be hearing from Madeline Wilson, who is an agricultural production systems specialist with Colorado State University Extension. Madeline's work focuses on market development for alternative crops and the revegetation of retired croplands. In her talk, Madeline will discuss conventional farming practices in the San Luis Valley, the approaching deadline to reduce groundwater withdrawals, and also explore potential paths forward for the region. We are really delighted and honored to have you both with us here today. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Heather. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for having me and for taking time out of your day. I'm always excited to talk about the San Luis Valley, which is a place that so many of us on this call love and is our home. It's a pretty exceptional place with just unfounded beauty and also really deep culture and heritage. And so I'm going to jump right in. When I talk about the San Luis Valley and the Rio Grande Basin, I usually do so interchangeably. And so we're talking about, Rio Grande Basin as the primary river system in the valley is the Rio Grande, with major tributaries being the Caneos, and a lot of other creeks and rivers. And then there are some other significant streams such as Swatch Creek, San Luis Creek, Alamosa River that aren't, the Alamosa can reach the Rio Grande, but they're not considered tributary for legal purposes. And so this is just the general area just to ground us as we're talking about the region and the San Luis Valley. And so if you take anything away, it's that the valley is an incredibly variable system. So from place to place or year to year, or even sometimes it feels like day to day and week to week, we see a lot of variability in our water supply, our weather, and our climate patterns. And so this shows the average precipitation for our region. And so if you came to Denver and you thought it was dry, this area is twice as dry. Usually the Front Range gets about between 13 and 26 inches of rain a year, and center Colorado gets less than 7. It used to be 7, now it's 6.9, and so we're trending down. We also in this basin have the most precipitation in Colorado with Wolf Creek Pass, which jockeys back and forth with rabbit ears from year to year. And so it's pretty striking that we see so much variability in such a short distance. And it really is part of our story of water development and then just living, breathing, working in this place that's so arid and so variable. But really the mountains that surround the valley are what provide the water to this region and therefore our livelihoods. This is what I want you to take away from this graph. This is the Rio Grande gauge for the Rio Grande River near Del Norte. It is the second oldest gauge in the country. The oldest is the Rio Grande near Taos. And so we're really fortunate that we have this record, and we have a lot of history where we can look back and get an understanding of the river flows into the area. The Rio Grande, again, is the largest contributor of water in the region and in our area, and is super important for all of the major industries, agriculture, recreation, just supporting fish and wildlife and so on. And so you can see that there's huge variability from year to year. If you kind of, focus your eye on just one or two of the bars and then look at the next couple, you'll notice that it's pretty rare that we have similar years back to back, or even a couple similar years in the row. We see a high year, a low year, bouncing back and forth. And so we never really know what to expect. And that's what makes managing water here a challenge. I will note that the decade from 1950 to 1960 is the lowest period on record. And so I used to sit as the Rio Grande Basin representative on the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and we received a really great report one year from Mark Udall talking about the changes on the Colorado. And I assume many of you on the call are looped into conversations on Colorado River matters. And he was talking about how, the last 2 decades have been so dry on the Colorado River. And really the 2000 to 2010 decade, there was no analog. They hadn't seen flows like that before, which caused me to look back at our record and to see that we actually had the 1950s were even drier than the early 2000s. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that 1950s period is a real bellwether and is just important for us as a part of our water management history, but then also as just understanding the context for things going forward. And so we started developing water right really early in this basin. The oldest water rights in the state are in the Rio Grande Basin. Of course, many water rights had been developed further down on the Rio Grande, but as far as Colorado goes, we do have the oldest water rights. We also have some of the largest water rights. And so you can see this timeline on the right that in the 1850s and 60s, we really got going with development of the streams and rivers. And then with the arrival of the railroad in the 1870s, that kicked off a huge period of development. And so by 1900, all of the water in the basin was spoken for. And so you'll hear us, when you're talking with those of us here or working on a water conversation, you'll hear the word over appropriated thrown around quite a bit. And what that means is that there are more claims to water than there is water available. It is very rare that we have a year where all water rights are satisfied. And in fact, most years, even some of the senior water rights, which are the older ones, aren't even satisfied. And so that's what over appropriation means. And it's part of our daily conversations and really part of the fabric of what we're trying to do, or just part of the conversation here, that scarcity is the norm and over appropriation is part of that. And so it being an agriculture region, the timing of runoff and the availability of runoff it's a big challenge for the region, but it was especially challenging in the late 1800s and early 1900s when all of the irrigation was surface irrigation. And so that was people physically pulling water out of out of streams and rivers, through ditches and canals, and physically running water across fields and irrigating that way. We don't have as much surface irrigation as we used to. And so that's why the surface water irrigation, I'm also putting a pin in that too, to give you guys the context for that. So as you'll see here, the green is when there's surface water available. That's a typical runoff season for the rivers. The Rio Grande generally peaks on June 2nd, although this year it was earlier. And then the period when our crops need and use water is later in the season. And so that imbalance between the availability and the timing of water causes people, not just in the Rio Grande Basin, but all over the rest of the West, to take action to try to add flexibility into their systems. And so in a lot of places, people built reservoirs so that they could store water. Because of our agreements with Texas and New Mexico through the Rio Grande Compact, our ability to build reservoirs of any size or functionality is a little bit limited. And so when the technology became available, people looked towards groundwater to help deal with this challenge of when the water was available and when the crops needed it. They also, when I speak about the technology, I'm talking about the advent of pumps and then rural electrification that followed World War II. And then you'll also remember from that graph, the timing of those events was around the 50s. And that again was a period of incredibly low stream flows for our region. And so that was another driving factor, that combination of having new technology available and also not having the surface water supplies available, that caused people to look elsewhere, to look to groundwater as a way to supplement their farming operations and stay afloat during challenging times. And so the San Luis Valley is really unique with our hydrology in that we have two underground aquifers that are layered on each other. The unconfined aquifer is the shallow aquifer that is it's at the top. It's easily recharged through rim flows or diversions from canals and ditches into the area of the closed basin where the unconfined is. It's really easy to see the relationship between water that goes in and out and recharge. There's also a confined aquifer, which is deeper. It's under pressure, and it's only recharged from a little bit of leakage with the unconfined, primarily with the rim inflows on the edges of the valley. And so the aquifers are separated by two clay layers, or excuse me, by multiple clay layers, but a couple are really significant. And so the area where the clay doesn't extend to, which is the edges of the valley, is also the area with the greatest amount of recharge. And so these aquifers are arguably our greatest asset, and that they allow us flexibility with our water use. We can treat them like reservoirs, and it can help us with that timing and balance. If we can bring water into the system when it's available and recharge it into the aquifers and then pump it out later when we need it, it's just this huge benefit and this opportunity. Unfortunately, we overrun the rabbit, just like we over appropriated the surface streams. We've overdeveloped our aquifers as well. And so this map shows the extent of well development in the San Luis Valley, which is pretty darn dense. And so that has caused us to see big changes in our groundwater levels. And so this shows, again, we've got the two aquifers. And so this shows the level of the unconfined aquifer in the closed basin, which has been declining really since the droughts of the early 2000s. You can see in the beginning part of the graph that aquifer levels, generally they varied some, but stayed within that kind of 0 to negative 400 range. I will note that 0 isn't necessarily full. 0 is the level when we first started monitoring the aquifer in 1976. And so with the drought of 2002 and the loss of stream flows to recharge the aquifer paired with high pumping levels, we've really seen a drop off in the levels of the unconfined aquifer. And that's it's frankly really scary for our region, because we do depend so much on the mix of surface water and groundwater to support our agriculture economy, which is the backbone for all of the economies and communities of the San Luis Valley. This is my favorite of all the graphs. You guys have probably figured out that I'm a data person. I like numbers, I like maps and graphs. And this one is my favorite because I think that it alone can really tell the story of what we're dealing with the unconfined aquifer. And so the green bars show the inflows into the closed basin area. So diversions from the river through canals and ditches to the area that recharges the unconfined aquifer. The blue shows pumping levels and the red shows unconfined aquifer levels. And so really zooming in on that 2002 year, you can see the significance of having super low inflows from the streams, really high pumping because of hot, dry temperatures, and then that incredible drop with the unconfined aquifer, and that we haven't been able to recover from. And so Madeline's going to talk more about the significance of the timing around our needs to come together and recover the aquifer and the community efforts. And so I'll let her cover that, but just as the data kind of background for this conversation, this graph tells a lot of that story. I also talked about the confined aquifer, and because it's under pressure and because it's not as easy to measure the water the water levels of the confined aquifer, I don't know why I can't say measure today. We measure the pressure levels. And so again, as you can see, the confined aquifer, while the changes have been less dramatic, we have seen declines in the pressure heads for the confined aquifer. And so those changes and those impacts to groundwater caused the community to work with the state of Colorado. We actually took the pretty admirable and I think impressive step of going to the legislature and asking them to instruct the state engineer to promulgate rules. So that's another really important part of our story. This basin is used to working together, and we also are fairly proactive in our approach to water management. And so the community said, we need to get out in front of this. We don't want a situation where the state engineer comes in and says, look, guys, your use of groundwater is unsustainable, and therefore I'm going to have to start shutting people off by priority in order to have sustainable systems. That happened on the South Platte, and we didn't want any part of it. We recognized that kind of decision would be catastrophic to our region. And so we asked the state engineer to work with us and to promulgate rules that would allow us to replace the injury that the wells caused to streams, and also take action to recover our aquifers, but in ways that are a little more creative than just picking a year and saying everybody whose well was built after this year is turned off. And so the result is that the area, the valley's been divided up into 7 different areas with similar groundwater hydrology. And the well users have come together into 7 different groundwater management subdistricts where they are working again on those 2 tasks, replacing the injury the wells caused to senior surface water rights holders and taking action to have sustainable aquifers. And again, I think Madeline's going to talk more about that second part, the sustainable groundwater piece. I'll note for you when you're at your meeting in the southern part of the valley next week that the subdistrict down there, subdistrict 3, is considered sustainable. And so a big misconception is that all of the subdistricts in the San Luis Valley are struggling. Really, subdistrict 1, which is the largest, and it's the unconfined aquifer subdistrict, is facing that big hurdle of recovering the unconfined aquifer. But with a lot of, we're very grateful to say that the confined aquifer and alluvial aquifer systems are at this point considered sustainable. And so there have been some big wins and successes with groundwater management, and we're hoping that through collaboration and innovation, we'll be able to get subdistrict 1 there as well. And so the big challenge is that not only do we have to learn to live with less, we have to reduce our use so that we can bring our groundwater supplies back to a sustainable level. We have to, be adaptable and resilient. We also have to do all of that with even less water than we previously had. And so it's this double-edged sword, I guess, of trying to, or it's not really double-edged as much as it's a 2-pronged sword coming at us, where we're really, we're trying to work together and balance our system, but the rules keep changing, I guess is another way of put it. Subdistricts were organized with this understanding of the supplies as they existed when we were organizing them, and that supply has changed dramatically. And so just looking at these numbers, again, we're so fortunate to have the period of record that we do on the Rio Grande, because then we can really understand our history and our story. From 1890 to 2000, the average stream flow crossing the Rio Grande gauge was 654,000 acre feet a year. If we just zoom in on the time frame from 2000 to 2024, that has reduced by 16%. And so if it feels like it's getting harder, it's because on average, there's 105,000 acre feet missing from the river. And so that's something that we're up against. Not only have we always dealt with scarcity, and scarcity has always been baked into our area, it's getting harder. On top of it, I zoomed in on that 1950s decade as the lowest decade on record, with that 502,600 acre feet average. And if we just look at the last 5 years, we're on track to be lower than that. And so again, if it feels hot and dry here, it's because it is. And the challenging thing is that you'll recall that I noted that, we've always found a way to engineer a solution. When we wanted to farm in a desert, we dug ditches and canals. When there wasn't enough water, we built reservoirs. When the reservoirs were challenging to build because of legal agreements, we dug wells. We don't have any other way to make or go get additional water. And so I think that we're the first generation that in this area with this system of water development that is going to have to figure out how to actually do more with less, rather than be creative and create a solution. And that is a really hard thing for us to live with and to work with. And so just for the context of what we're up against, and as you're thinking about creative and collaborative solutions, it's how do we do more with less? How do we find ways to be resilient in the face of having much less water, and not the ability to just, again, employ some engineers and do something creative to fix the problem. Unfortunately, the Colorado Climate Report anticipates that this trend is just going to keep going, that we expect to have less stream flow, less snowpack, earlier stream flows, higher temperature, and therefore higher environmental demand and lower water available. And so just, if I haven't depressed you enough here over the lunch hour, the challenges in this area are great and will require us to continue to work together, because these challenges are going to continue I think continue to surprise us, but also just to grow in magnitude. And so I think that's it for my slides. Thanks again for the opportunity to present, and I hope this was useful as far as the context of the hydrology of the San Luis Valley.
Thank you so much, Heather. Madeline, do you want to go ahead?
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Let me just figure out how to get this screen shared. Okay, can y'all see that? So my name is Madeline Wilson. I'm a ag production systems specialist with CSU Extension. My office is based on the 9 Mile here, so in that what we call center region of our primary production hub. My work is focused on water conservation, and what that largely looks like is alternative crop market development and also the revegetation of retired production centers, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit here. But for reference, the northern part of, or I guess really the central part of the San Luis Valley did exhibit some shifting ephemeral wetlands at points in its historic hydrologic history. And that's largely because of what Heather was talking about, the surface waters coming down and pooling in what we call an endoheric basin, meaning there's no natural hydrologic outflow. So it recharged the aquifer. The water table was relatively high. In fact, there's some farms close to me where the older generations remember not being able to graze their horses close to their home because it was so swampy and marshy and having to move it. Those days are long since gone. The water table has dropped due to the overdraw of our unconfined aquifer. We're also home to the Great Sand Dunes National Park, which some friends of mine call a testament to the wind erosive capacity of our valley. These are thousands and thousands of years of wind eroded sediments from this ancient lake bottom that have moved over to the east. And obviously, as our water table has dropped and we've had more and more intensive agriculture, the wind erosion capacity has only increased. And here are some pictures of the sandhill cranes who do remember when this region, they migrate through this region as breeding ground, and they do remember when this was a wetter region and has long since changed. This is them actually grazing on some barley fields in the valley. This is what our valley looks like now. This is the northern region. You can see the Rio Grande cutting across the lower left-hand corner of the screen. And we're looking at center pivots at mass density. And this is sub-district 1 that Heather was referring to. So it's where Rio Grande, Saguache, and Alamosa County all kind of come together. On the west side, over to the left of your screen, that's mostly alfalfa production. That's why the circles are largely green. And then as you move east, we have more barley and alfalfa, or barley and potato production, because our sands are a little looser, sandier. It just makes management easier when there's not as much rocks in the picture. This is another version of the map that Heather shared earlier, where you can see the surface water coming in to our valley. This yellow region is the Quaternary alluvium, where the dual layer aquifer sits. And you can see just the prolific wells that are concentrated largely in Saguache, Rio Grande, and Conejos County on the San Juan side of the valley here. What do we grow with those wells? Largely potatoes. There's some statistics that say 1 in 4 fresh market potatoes. So if you're going to a Walmart or a Kroger, are from our region. So besides Idaho, we are the largest concentration of potato producing farms. We also grow a lot of barley. While that is declining in recent years, there was a statistic from about 7 years ago that said basically 1 in 6 cores is barley from our valley. We also grow a lot of alfalfa, and I'm mentioning alfalfa particularly for its relevance in Conejos County, where our event next week is located. This is an amazing study that Heather put together with One Water Econ and American Rivers that looked at our water and as it ties to the economic valley or the economic generation in our valley. And this table at the top breaks down the agricultural economic output by county and also by our region. So our region produces almost 40% of Colorado's agricultural economic output. And given that most of that is derived from groundwater, it is extremely important for protecting our way of life, our economy, our state's economy, even our national food security, that we figure out how to reduce water consumption and still have our lands working. So I want to draw your eye to Conejos County here, which 18.6% of the county economic output is derived from agriculture, as well as Rio Grande and Saguache counties, where it's 10 and 26% respectively, contributing to over $481 million revenue. Here again is our subdistrict map, and I'm just drawing your eye back to it so that you can look at this red region, subdistrict 1. This is the region that's struggling. We are struggling to recover the unconfined aquifer, and that's largely due to climate factors, to the overappropriation of water, but then also how we're growing our food and what kind of food we're growing. So in order to be in compliance with current plans of water management, that Subdistrict 1 has come together to, we all opted in within Subdistrict 1 in the early 2000s to manage how we use our water. And in order to come in compliance, to bring that graph up to what Heather called the sustainable level, right, 0, we're about 1.4 million acre feet overdrawn. Subdistrict 1 must retire between 40,000 and 100,000 irrigated acres. That's about 333 farms. And at random, it looks like this. All those black dots would be farms that are pulled out of production and dried up in order to meet our sustainability goals. Current plans of water management have given a 2031 deadline to accomplish meeting that 0 metric on that big scary graph that Heather showed earlier. There are other plans of water management in court right now that just need to show a sustainable, essentially moving upward, trending upward on that graph. However, we have not seen that progress under current sustainability plans. So for all intents and purposes, it's safe to say that we can anticipate large amounts of land coming out of production by 2031. That'll obviously have a massive impact on our economies. So this is a study that CSU Extension put together in the mid-2000s, which showed at random across different crop acreage, the reduction in acreage necessary to meet sustainability goals, and then that impact on the economic output. So you can see a loss of almost $30 million annually if at random these acres were to retire. Obviously, there are certain crops that use more water. There's certain regions that have more water resources, so it won't be at random, but it was an academic study, and this was the way it made sense to do mathematically. So sort of carrot and stick approach, Subdistrict 1 has imposed pumping fees on producers who pump beyond their surface water credits. So most producers in the valley have a combination of surface water rights and then junior water rights, which are obviously your groundwater usage. If you pump beyond what you have in surface water, you are subject to a $150 an acre foot pumping fee. If you have 0 surface water rights, that looks at like about $60,000 a year on one circle, just in the cost of water alone. That's not including electricity. That's not including maintenance on your pivot, all of your agricultural inputs, time, labor, anything, just $60,000 to use water. That is set to go up to $500 an acre foot if the current plan is replaced by the one that's pending in water court, which will definitely drastically impact how we're able to produce in the valley, who's able to produce, which could also lead to the accumulation of water rights and resources in several farms and just massive landscape change in general. This presents some challenges, clear challenges, but also opportunities if we're able to see kind of both sides of the coin. So irrigation technologies are something that producers have really widely accepted in the valley as ways to make their water use more efficient. You also have the opportunity to grow something different, alternative crops that use less water as compared to potatoes or alfalfa or barley. And then obviously dry ups, which are already underway in the valley. People who have been sort of economically forced out of production because they can't afford to pay the water pumping fees. And then obviously there's this impending deadline that will drastically increase the dry ups. So to talk a little bit about irrigation efficiencies and technologies, most producers have employed these at this point. They've lowered their sprinklers to reduce evapotranspiration. They've changed wobblers. They've utilized AI and remote sensing, soil sensing technologies to become more efficient of how much and when they water. While that has shown some case-by-case economic savings by and large, it has not done communally enough to recharge our aquifer. In fact, this is a graph pulled from OpenET, where we can see high dark blue and light blue evapotranspiration on pivots. On a windy day, we can see up to 50% loss, even with these technologies employed. So it's just a dry, arid place, and it's hard to keep water in the plant. You can see in subdistrict 1 up here, this yellow region, these are mostly potato farms, and you might ask why their evapotranspiration is lower. This region struggles to implement cover crops due to a lot of economic constraint within their farm, also just cultural and traditional practices. Cover crops use water. The transpiration of the plant uses water. So that's why you're seeing it slightly lighter. It's because there's more bare ground exposure during the calendar year in between production seasons. So the other thing we mentioned was growing something different. And that is a super easy understatement. You can grow something different, but will people buy something different? And will you see an economic return on that crop? So Heather's also involved with the Rye Resurgence Project, which is a beautiful case study of trying to stimulate market development for something that uses less water. I just mentioned cover cropping. Rye is a winter cover crop that can be grown in between cash crop production seasons, in between potatoes, as many benefits. It uses less water than any sort of other green manure, but it also has a market value. Things like dry beans and millet and other small grains also use less water, but unless we have the ability to sell them to markets, they could be export markets, they could be local markets, it doesn't matter that they save water. Things that limit our competitiveness of these crops is our ability to process these crops locally. Most processing for things like dry beans and millet are located in the northeast of the state and our population centers. And then also the fact that we're so far away from most markets. So our freight costs drastically reduce the profitability of these alternative crops. So that's something to be thinking about for the creatives in the room, is how to increase demand for these crops and how to overcome those hurdles of transportation and processing. And then lastly, the inevitable dry up of certain lands. So this is a map of Subdistrict 1 sustainability programs in which producers can opt in to the voluntary retirement of their groundwater rights. Red is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. That's a national program that's baked into the Farm Bill, in which producers can receive annual payments to not use their land. Green and blue are different well buyout programs, both at the local and at the state level or the basin level, in which producers will receive a one-time payment for the retirement of their water right. And then orange is folks that are opting into a yearly temporary fallow. This is just what we have in terms of Subdistrict 1 data. There are people who are retiring their groundwater rights and selling them on or pulling them off of one circle and then trading them in the private market. So Heather mentioned something called recharging the aquifer, which is when people pull water from the river, bring it to their land, recharge it in a pit, in a way cashing the water into the aquifer bank, and then they cash out water from the aquifer bank somewhere else. So that is possible within Subdistrict 1, which is one of those self-fulfilling sort of rules of the game that have led to our overuse of water in some regions. But this is just kind of showing some hot spots in which land is drying up. And if it's not dried up and revegetated properly, we have extreme risk of wind erosion events. So this is from a pivot it was in mid-March out east in that low evapotranspiration region that I was showing you. This is a potato circle that is in between cycles. There was no cover crop on it. This is just your standard windy day in the valley. But without native plants or even non-native plants or even weeds holding this dirt down, we have massive wind erosion events that can lead to car accidents. It can end up on our snowpack and reduce our dwindling recharge that is coming from our mountains. It can end up on neighbors' fields. It can increase the taxpayer burden on road maintenance. In general, this is just a far increasing reality as more and more land comes out of production, or as more and more people are unable to afford to put a cover crop in because water pumping fees are so high. This is what a revegetated field looks like if you just let it do its thing. These are weeds coming in. This is bare dirt. It does not satisfy the academic 30% ground cover metric that reduces wind erosion. 30% is a shockingly low standard to reduce wind erosion, but native plants are really good at doing their job when you take that into consideration. This is another field that was pulled out of production and just left to do its thing. These are all tumbleweeds that will blow onto neighbors' field. They'll fill ditches. They'll increase herbicide use amongst their neighbors. So that's increased input costs, not to mention the environmental concern of increased herbicides. Compared with, these are two pictures of what a native rangeland can look like. So far more than that 30% ground cover with species that are highly nutritious for grazing purposes. So part of what I'm working on, and what I'm hoping y'all designers and creatives in the room, scientists, folks working on other aquifer dependent regions, is a revegetation playbook. And that's a sort of if this, then that guide for revaluing dry lands. We need to find some socially compatible, ecologically viable, and then economically capable dryland solutions, which need you to center the producer's values. What are they hoping to use this land for? It needs to integrate climate data, the direct land characteristics of soil and soil chemical and microbiological properties. What is the capacity for certain plant species and water retention? It needs to look at biological case studies, different seed mixes, planting dates, the implementation of microtopography. A lot of these lands have been flattened to create more efficient farming ground. That is obviously not how the valley used to look. Different irrigation strategies that more mimic our water, our natural precipitation events. Noxious weed management is a huge one. You're looking at 120 acres of Russian thistle and kochia that could present serious ecological concern to neighboring fields and also native rangelands. And then what could these be used for, these dry lands? Could it be used for grazing, native seed production, greenhouses, even solar development? And the reason why we need to look at that is because if there is going to be increased voluntary retirement of water rights so that we avoid this impending sort of 2031 deadline in which the state does have the right to come in and shut down our wells, we need to figure out what drylands can be used for. So revaluing drylands, that's sort of the call to action, and why we're so excited about this event next week, in which we're really centering producers, multi-generation producers who have been working the land since before Colorado was a state, and they've been valuing the dry land. They've been moving animals across the dry land and figuring out how to support our food systems and the local economies on dry lands. It's going to be a little bit difficult in the parcelized, fragmented geometric puzzle that is center pivot agriculture in the north. But I think with some collaborative mindset, as Heather was mentioning, and really just pulling all our possible resources together, there is no other water solution. We just have to figure out how to either value lower water use crops or value dry lands. So that is what I was going to talk to you all about today. Dylan, what's next?
Thank you so much, Madeline, and thank you again, Heather. These are really important pieces of this puzzle, and we're really grateful to have your two presentations today for us to ruminate on and respond to. And I think let's see, before we open it up for questions, I wanted to give a prompt to Angie, if you care to say a little bit more about the event coming up next week and how this ties in, and then we will open it up for Q&A. And actually, if people want to start putting questions in the chat, we can start pulling them from there for Heather and Madeline in just a few moments as well. So go ahead, Angie, you should be able to unmute yourself, I think. Yeah, there you go. Hello. Hi, Angie.
Hi. Okay, thank you. I was just going to type in. I couldn't unmute. Okay, thank you. Okay, so one thing that caught my attention about Heather's talk was that where I'm at, I'm in Subdistrict 3. My name's Angie Mestres. I come from a multi-generational ranch family who operates across the Colorado-New Mexico border. And one thing that caught my attention about Heather's talk was that in Subdistrict 3, where I am in the southernmost part of the valley, we're considered sustainable. And I think a big part of that, and I'd be so interested to hear like Heather's perspective on this, but I think a big part of that is that we use public land or leased land outside of the valley for our operation. So my family produces, and many families in our area produce both crops and livestock. And so we can alleviate some of the pressure, some of the production pressure on our cropland in the southern part of the valley by taking our crop consumers, our cows, outside of the valley, and particularly onto BLM grazing allotments in northern New Mexico. And so this event that we're having next week in Colorado really showcases some of the families and the resources that make it possible to have that sustainable usage of water in the valley for our subdistrict. So we're going to be having range management specialists come out and talk about how to use livestock to promote soil health and how to utilize the forage that's produced just naturally on our rangelands. So with the love of numbers and data, I was doing a few quick lookups during the presentations, but I recorded that in Colorado, there's over 7 million acres of BLM land, and in New Mexico, there's over 13 million acres of rangeland. So the West is famous for its wide open spaces, and many of those spaces are owned and managed by both the BLM and the Forest Service. And so the forage that is produced there is one of the solutions to this story of how we make agriculture sustainable in other parts of the country, because we also utilize that resource to produce food. And we're also going to have a lot of attention to the power and role of conservation districts in this battle to have our agriculture sustainable. So we just reformed our Conejos County Conservation District, and that was done at the Wright-Ingraham event last fall in Cortez. And we're going to have a talk from Peter V. Hill, who's in northern New Mexico and has done a lot of work with his conservation district, uplifting cattle producers on rangeland and private land in the Southwest. We're going to have animal scientists come out and talk about the condition of animals that are produced on rangeland, and we're going to do a whole day of field studies during our range school, which is July 11th, which is a Friday. And so like all of this though comes, back to this idea that like we need collaborative conservation, we need partners, we need to open the invitation to researchers, creatives, artists, policymakers to join in on this conversation and help problem solve how we make this sustainable, and not just for our aquifer and our landscapes, but also for our families. So even though Subdistrict 3 is considered sustainable, if we looked at the county profile for Conejos County, we would see that we lost over 30% of our farms, and we had a reduction in people that were using agriculture for their livelihood and for the economy of the area. So I think there's two different things to pay attention to. It's like sustainability of our aquifer and range and agricultural production, and then also the sustainability of family farmers and ranchers. So yeah, open invitation to everyone. The link to RSVP and more about the event is on the group chat. Thanks so much.
Pasting that in here again now. Thank you so much, Angie, for introducing that event next week, and we're so excited to come out and work with you all on that. So there's a question in the chat from Anna Grady, and I think if others have questions, you can put them in the chat and or raise your hand, and we can call on you to unmute yourself. But the question from Anna dovetails with another question that was directed to me. Anna says, many thanks to Heather and Madeline. Very interesting and compelling issues. You talked a lot about supply problems. I'm wondering about demand and consumption trends. Can you comment on what the demand graph looks like? Are there ways to change people's consumption habits so that it does not require the growing of such water-heavy foods? And I want to connect that to another question that was in the chat that asks about Madeline, you were talking about the traditional practices used in the northern part of the valley. I'm wondering if that connects here, that there are unique agricultural practices or just a kind of culture that observes certain practices there, and how open they are to this idea of changing toward less water heavy products.
Sure. Heather is also probably primed to speak on this. She does it most of her day. But I'm sure many of you have eaten a potato in the past month. How many of you have eaten millet? Probably maybe one person in this room, Heather. It's hard pressed getting my husband to eat millet, but that's exactly what it is. Is the market demands potatoes. Same way market demands corn, right? We've figured out ways to use it in all sorts of different products, fresh market, starched. There's many frozen foods. So part of what I was speaking to earlier is that there are ways to reduce producer consumption of water. Most people have employed it already. They've figured out ways to make their irrigation efficiency irrigation technologies more efficient. They have implemented different soil health strategies. In fact, some of the most prosperous potato farms in the valley do cover crop because they've realized the year-on-year effect on their yields. But the end of the day, if we're going to grow something different, it comes from the consumer demand. Obviously, a lot of consumer demand is on a national, even international puzzle as different countries experience conflict. They come on and offline and change that international demand for a lot of things like beans and millet. So it is on our side too, as eaters and buyers of food products, to shift that demand. And Heather, you might be able to speak about the challenges of creating demand for rye.
Yeah, I think that Madeline nailed it, and just to add even a little more color to what she noted, that so the graph on demand, it definitely would be trending down. People aren't sitting on their heels. This area is, in addition to being the most intensely irrigated agriculture region in the world, it also employs some of the most cutting edge technology. And so, there's a lot of there are a lot of misconceptions about farmers and thinking that, you know, they're all just doing what their dad did and they don't want to change. That's not the community we live in. And as she mentioned, you know, these really successful potato farms are often successful because they're really cutting edge. They're using soil moisture probes and autonomous pivots and trying different crops and all these different ways to try to reduce inputs so that they can improve their bottom line. And so in Subdistrict 1, last year, we saw the lowest groundwater pumping on record, and we still saw the aquifer decline. And so that's the challenge, that our supply problems just, you know, the supply problems around the mountains are, you know, that's a little harder to wrap our arms around, but the supply is in recharging groundwater it's just so challenging because, you know, we can't do a whole lot about the supply. So what we can control is the demand, and people are very aggressively working on reducing demand. And so I think the second part of the question is, what are people doing? Like Madeline mentioned, you know, a farm that my dad managed for 20 years started using cover crops in place of barley in the early 2000s. And now they don't grow any barley, which is a culturally challenging thing for a lot of people. Some of these family farms have been Coors barley growers for 50 years. It's pretty tough not to get invited to the Coors reception and not to get the cool Coors hat. I personally have some grower hats that I really enjoy because they're cool. But the reality is that we have to figure out how to do more with less and be productive. And Madeline mentioned the Rye Resurgence Project, which I'm a co-founder of. It's really freaking hard, guys. Like it is really easy to say all we need to do is grow crops that consume less. There's so much risk there. And by just saying that, I've said it too. I was part of writing the first Rio Grande Basin implementation plan and had all these nice words in there about potential solutions for agriculture, become more efficient, use technology, grow less water intensive crops, practice cover cropping, do rotational fallowing. It's all of these things that are true and make a lot of sense and put the risk on the farmers. And part of the Rye Resurgence Project is acknowledging that it is unfair for us as water managers and us as consumers and us as part of this water management ecosystem that everybody on this call is part of. All of our choices impact water use and impact the future of the West by the foods that we buy and the things that we do. And so it's really easy for us to feel like, well, we just go to the grocery store. Those guys are making the water management decisions. But by not acknowledging that the markets have to be there for people to change, it is very easy for someone who used to grow barley to grow rye, and they can save up to a foot an acre. So we're talking about over a field, 120 acre feet, which would supply over 600 households in Denver a year. It's significant. But they're not going to do it unless they can make money, because just like you and me, they're trying to pay their mortgages, they're trying to pay for their car loans, they're trying to buy ballerina shoes for their kids. And so if we expect farmers to be able to experiment and jump into these new markets, millet, beans, rye, quinoa, hemp, all of these things, canola, my dad can tell you all the different things that he tried because he's a pretty forward-thinking guy. And it all comes back to that farmers are willing to do it. There just needs to be the markets. And it's really exciting to see the Colorado Water Conservation Board and others investing in projects like the Rye Resurgence Project with that acknowledgement that if we are just, again, onlookers saying people need to grow less water intensive crops, then they can't do it, because farming is fun, but it's also a livelihood. It's a living. And so we have to help people, help provide markets if we expect people to transition and be more resilient. And so that's what we're trying to do with the Rye Resurgence Project. It wouldn't be possible without the money from the Colorado Water Conservation Board and from that acknowledgement that we have to build markets. There has to be a place for farmers to go rather than just expecting them to own that risk, because they can grow it, but where are they going to sell it? So I'll step off my soapbox.
Amazing. Thank you, Heather. So I'm trying to weave together some of these questions, and one of them is here from Toby. Can the long-term survival of a food supply overcome immediate greed? What are the lessons to be learned? Are they universally applicable? And maybe adding into that a question about who, like, this is sort of pointing back to the social dynamics in terms of, the unequal implications of output reductions, and how does this play out with the social dynamics and social impacts of water challenges in the valley? You can connect the dots on those two questions. Maybe I'll kick that one to you first, Madeline.
Can you dumb it down for me?
First question. Well, okay. So the first part of the question is in the chat, and it's this question of can this long-term survival of a food supply overcome the immediate need, which I think maybe Heather was speaking to that a bit, and sort of the market-based need. And then, are there any lessons to be learned? Are they universally applicable? And maybe if they're not universally applicable,
Yeah,
a question of who's affected with these shifts first, and is it unequally distributed within the valley? What are the social dynamics happening?
yes. So I'll tackle the food supply thing first. So there's definitely universal implications. We have a lot of agricultural communities that are dependent on groundwater across our nation that are facing water curtailment at the hands of their state and or national policymakers and decision makers. And if we can figure out these different buckshot approaches to localizing our food system and localizing the demand, then we are less at a whim of, say, Ukraine popping online and selling a bunch of millet, and now we can't sell millet anymore. So there is something to be said for this model of connecting like front range consumers with San Luis Valley producers. It's a smaller cycle. We're able to keep more of that trickle down processing dollars in state. The longer the supply chain gets, the less viable these crops become for our growers. And then just to touch base on this like social dynamics at play. So there's a lot of opinions on how the well curtailment would play out. Some of the engineers that I have spoken with say that it would be a blanket shut off of wells, and you would need to refile your water management plan, prove that you're sustainable, you have the surface water credits to pump, and then you can come back online. We're already seeing the private transfer of water rights. For example, out west in Subdistrict 1, alfalfa producers are realizing that potato guys will pay more for their water than dairy guys in Texas will pay for their alfalfa. So they're coming out of production, they're recharging the water in the ground, and someone else out east who's growing potatoes is pumping their water credits. So we are seeing a consolidation in that sense of water credits, of pumping credits. And if we were to see a widespread shutoff, when farms came back online, we would surely see a consolidation there as well. So I hope that answers that kind of social piece. And that's within Subdistrict 1. To speak a little bit to Subdistrict 3, where Angie is, there's a lot of alfalfa production. Currently, we're seeing a lot of dairies move back east. There was a kind of migration of dairies out to the Midwest, but now, because of their water shortages and the intense water needed to run a dairy, a large-scale dairy, they're moving back east where water is more prolific. That makes the hauling and transportation of alfalfa less able to pencil out. We are seeing more variable rains. We're getting rains on third cuttings of alfalfa where it was a little bit more predictable in the past. And so the alfalfa market is definitely changing. So it will impact Subdistrict 3, but more in a market demand sense. Heather, anything to add?
Heather, I might prompt you to get back on your soapbox for a minute to just read what you would put in the chat, because I'd love to hear it and have it on the video record too. Thank you.
Oh, there was a question about, can the long-term survival of a food supply overcome immediate greed? What are the lessons to be learned, and are they universally applicable? And that was from Toby. And I think that that's a great question, and that's kind of the question, right? That I think it goes back to us seeing ourselves as part of the system and part of the community that we want to be in. And I was talking about this in a different context, but I think there's a through line in, I was asked, what do we need to do as far as water outreach and education in Colorado if we're going to have a hotter, drier future, and to help us have a sustainable future where there still are vibrant rural communities and robust agriculture. And I think it's that somehow we have to have a shared ethic, and we have to agree that we value each other. We value rural communities. We value local healthy food supplies. We value our neighbors having opportunity more than we value our own convenience and our own luxuries. And in that context, it's bluegrass. It's having, expansive water uses in cities that causes those cities who are mandated to supply water for their residents to go out and buy farms for that water supply. And so how do we as residents of Colorado get newcomers and ourselves and our moms and our aunts and everybody to recognize that there is not enough water and that we cannot grow this state with the next million people like we grew the last million people? We do not have enough water to support all these different things, to have healthy rivers where there are fish and rafting, and to have robust farms that can provide this food supply that we depend on, and also have, again, these backbones to the communities. And so how do we as people see ourselves and say, you know what, I'm going to choose landscaping that recognizes that I value water conservation and I value water in rivers. And I think food is the same thing. How do we share that ethic where we're like, I am willing to find out where my food comes from. I was in Grand Junction last week at the liquor store with my older brother, because that's what one does when they see their older brother. And he started to grab a bottle of Tanqueray so we could have some gin and tonic. So I was like, no, you got to buy Mythology, because the owner of Mythology is Scott from Steamboat, and he's really cool, and he's working with us on the Rye Resurgence Project and makes kick-ass gin. And so my brother's like, oh, no way, I can't believe you know this guy. And then he texted me the next day and was like, hey, we need more gin because it's so good. But it's like when we buy Tanqueray, where does that money go? I don't know. But when I buy Mythology, I know where that money goes. And I know that there is value in supporting that. Scott has an ethic where he's supporting local farmers. So how do we as ourselves, and how do we help our family and our neighbors really think about the decisions that we're making, how single thing that we buy and put in our bodies impacts the water supply and the agriculture community? So there you go, Dylan. That's another soapbox for you, but you invited me up there.
I will add as well that the US, we spend of most developed countries, the least amount of our disposable income on food. We're something like 5% as compared with like France, that's up there at 14%, and Japan and Australia are between like 10 and 15%. And we're just not used to paying for our food, and it's gonna come sooner or later. And we need to start recognizing that we can vote with our dollar at every meal. And for those that are business owners to have more impact on where we source our ingredients.
As a rejoinder to that, I'm going to read Leslie Sobel's comment here. Leslie, thank you for this in the chat. Leslie's wondering about making a climate resilient cookbook and food program, maybe finding celebrity chef cookbook author to partner with, help push an agenda of changing what foods people eat. She says, maybe wacky, but a conversation we need to have beyond typical stuff about eating less meat.
Definitely. And if you can convince some of those big whiskey people to buy our rye, the supply chain to get it out is a little bit easier than, something like millet needs to be dehulled for human consumption. Who's dehulling it? Our farmers are still going to lose those margins. So if you have connections, if you know people who will purchase alternative crops because they care about our San Luis Valley story and our people and our water and our land, then please connect us with them. We're constantly working that angle. And if it's not us, then someone in the Valley will definitely benefit from that market relationship.
I'm going to read a question from Tal here, which is a good one that I was similarly trying to think about how to ask, and he asked it very well in the chat. So are there global, so seeing that this is broad issue and that there are many regions and agricultural regions that are facing water shortages and mega droughts, are there global knowledge exchange programs in place that connect between arid agricultural regions that you're aware of? And are there places on Earth doing this right, let's say, that SLV and maybe in particular Subdistrict 1 can learn from?
I don't know of like an existing platform. There are some like food and water conferences. Like there's one in Nebraska at the Daugherty Center that brings in people from all over the world. There's, you know, ancient and new technologies emerging all the time. I'm not sure if there's an official group that exists. Maybe it's you guys. Heather, do you have someone you turn to for that kind of thing?
That's a good question. I read a lot of news, but as far as rye stuff, we're following other groups like Rye Revival out east that's trying to do something similar. For a lot of this water stuff, I'll pick the brains of CWCB staff and Laura Spann, who is the director or the project manager for Colorado Water Plan grants in the Southwest and Rio Grande basins. She has her finger in so many different projects, and so I tune into CWCB meetings or peruse the water plan grant applications, because that has become, the water plan grant program is funded with sports betting, and so when other things have dried up, the funding there is still available, and so it's this really fertile ground for people being creative and trying to solve water problems in their own communities. And so that's my go-to, as I try to pay attention to CWCB and what's going on there and the types of projects that people are doing. So they're really smart people around Colorado. I think for as far as a national or even global exchange, I can't think of anything, but it would be really cool if we could hear what other people are doing.
And if you're to break it down into those three categories of solutions that I was discussing, like the ag technology definitely has its existing forums and connections. That's Extension's purpose. That's most universities are working on that. That second category, that alternative crops market development, places like the regional food business centers that are popping up around the country, they're pretty good at connecting markets. That third piece, the revaluation of drylands, of transitioning from irrigated to dryland systems, that is where I've had the most difficulty exchanging of ideas. So I'm really hoping that we can connect with some creative people that can help us, A, revegetate these lands in a cost-effective and ecologically effective way, and then B, reimagine what these landscapes can be used for in a way that still brings dollars to these families that depend on these lands working, and also reduces water consumption. So that is really my call to action. If anyone knows of creative landscape architects or designers, I think it's time to start expanding the conversation beyond a typical restoration project, which is the lens we've been viewing it as, and expanding it into, okay, what are the potential economic livelihood uses of this land?
Thank you both again for those responses. I want to give another call out for questions here. So if there are other burning questions, people on the call, Wright-Ingraham board, other folks who would like to weigh in, please feel free to. Okay, here we have, oh, Catherine. Hi, Catherine. I was interested in Madeline's lecture, oh yeah, in Cortez at the Dust on Snow Symposium, when she mentioned that a community regarding these issues must be created, something close to that. Yeah, may exist now around current issues, but is a recreation of communities needed that might include both local and global experiments? Yeah, so tied into that question, where do you see that role for community engagement?
I'm really hoping that we can expand our definition of community. Right now, if you're to revegetate your land, just exclusively putting seed on it so the dust doesn't blow, it's going to cost you almost $100,000 to do it. So at that point, you're pretty burnt out on trying new technologies, things like implementing microtopography or animals into the process, or maybe saving some of your water back in your retirement of water rights to do something through like greenhouses, right? Talking to Heather at the San Luis Water Conservancy to figure out a small use of that water. It's hard to do when you're already spending that much money to put your ground to rest. So I'm hoping that our definition of community can include some other people who have research goals, have landscape design goals that can come in and work side by side with these producers, bring some of their financial resources to try something different. And as far as internal community goes, we do a monthly revegetation call. We, at our ag conference this last year, had a fun think tank in which Heather supplied the cookies and the whiskey, and we envisioned different uses for our land. So it is slowly emerging in that grassroots sense, but I think if we're going to try some crazy ideas, we'll need a little help from the outside.
Anything to add to that, Heather? Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Another, what would be a crazy idea? Yeah, that's
Okay, here's a great one.
What do you got?
So I was working with some folks that specialize on wetland restoration, and they had dredged a bunch of ditches and pulled out the sediment, the high organic matter sediment from these ditches. And we thought, well, it would be interesting to put them on some of the super low organic matter, very overworked sandy soils to assist in the revegetation project, right? Reintroducing organic matter, reintroducing finer sediment that would slow down water infiltration. But to haul dirt from west or to east across the valley, right, over 40 miles, we were talking like $120,000 just in hauling it and putting it on there alone. We cannot ask a private landowner to absorb that cost, not knowing if it'll work or not. And then we said, well, maybe we'll do it at a small scale. But everyone knows that if you do a cute little strip trial plot on the research farm, it's a lot harder to scale it up. You learn all sorts of things when you get bigger machinery involved in larger swaths of land. So that was a crazy idea. Another one was re-implementing microtopography. We were like, yes, let's re-add hills and little swales and little dips and little valleys, because when you go out onto a rangeland, you see the shrubs kind of on top of that hill, and then just on that slow micro topographic relief, you see grasses. So we thought that might be a way to encourage natural biodiversity. Well, how do we know what patterning to use? Okay, we have to do a LiDAR survey. Now the LiDAR survey is $75,000. Who's going to pay for that? And so all of these things that we can just kind of, mess around and find out, cost money. And if we're going to keep track of them in a way that's replicable and the data is solid and the theory is sound so that it can be disseminated further than the valley, then we need to also add that research and monitoring layer on top of it that also has a cost. So those are some crazy ideas. If I wanted to buy some water back from Heather at the San Luis Valley Water Conservancy District to put a greenhouse up, and try to do some, after that well is retired, that also comes with a price tag. So there's some things. And the idea is underway elsewhere. This is where things get interesting, because there are some ideas with dryland farming in regions in which that's possible. Our growing season is so short that without the manipulation of one of the variables, water, sunlight, soil, it's going to be pretty difficult. So it's possible to kind of copy paste some of those metrics, but it'll come with more of an investment in infrastructure. For example, the grazing piece. If we're going to move cows across these revegetated lands, you'd need fencing and watering resources, or a bunch of cowboys to move them, because they're 120-acre circles. So you could put in e-fencing. That's something that other regions have looked at. It would require an investment to apply it here.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this is a good place to wrap it up for us. And ending it on the what might be possible and what comes next. And just to say, I know Heather and Madeline, you are both actively seeking collaborators and supporters and people to work with you on these issues. So I encourage everybody on the call to reach out, and we can also connect folks to the work that you're doing. We're going to send around a summary of this talk as well as a link to the video, so you can share this with other folks in your communities who might be interested and might come up with their own crazy ideas for how do we get beyond here and get ahead of what comes next. So yeah, on behalf of everybody at Wright-Ingraham Institute, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, taking the time to be together with us in community. And as Tal put in the chat, you can email us at admin@wrightingraham.org if you have any additional questions, and we'll forward it along to the speakers. And of course, if you are in Antonito, Colorado next week, we hope to see you there at the Working the Llano Sin Agua Regenerative Ag Summit and Range School. And thank you so much, Angie and Madeline, for taking the lead on organizing that, with Larry Brown there as well, I see on the call. So grateful to have you here, and we'll see you there next week. Thanks, everybody.